Back in 1954, a giant radioactive dinosaur crawled out of the ocean and stomped Tokyo flat. And somehow, we never got over it. Because over 70 years later, giant monsters are still everywhere. Godzilla, King Ghidorah, Ultraman's endless parade of city-destroying nightmares, the weekly monstrosities getting launched into downtown by Rita Repulsa like she was running a Kaiju subscription service, the angels in Evangelion,
Fuck is that thing?
the Titans, the Kaijus in Pacific Rim, the giant mutant disasters constantly escaping Dexter's laboratory. Even the fucking Powerpuff Girls spend a concerning amount of time throwing hands with creatures the size of office buildings. And honestly, the weirdest part isn't that the giant monsters exist. The weirdest part is that they never leave. Because genres die all the time, trends disappear, audiences move on, but every generation somehow ends up creating its own version of the giant monster. The design changes, the powers change, the story changes, but the monster always comes back.
It's been 3 days now since the guinea pigs and the guinea bees attacked.
Which raises a pretty interesting question. Why? Why do humans keep imagining gigantic creatures that level cities? Why has every generation reinvented the kaiju? Why does this genre keep surviving long after the fears that created it are gone? Maybe every generation creates the monsters it fears most. And if this is true, then the history of kaiju isn't really a history of giant monsters. It's the history of fear itself. This is Kaiju, the Shape of Fear. So, before we get to Godzilla, before the mushroom clouds, before the radioactive dinosaurs, before Japan accidentally created one of the most influential genres in entertainment history, we need to talk about monsters.
Isn't that the same thing?
Because despite what a lot of people think, giant monsters did not begin with Godzilla. Godzilla was just the latest version. And honestly, human beings have been creating kaijus for as long as we've been telling stories, just under different names. Because if you go back far enough, every civilization on Earth starts doing something really interesting. Whenever people encounter something they couldn't fully understand, they gave it a face. The ocean, that became Leviathan, a gigantic sea beast lurking beneath the waves capable of swallowing entire ships. Storms, those became angry gods hurling lightnings from the heavens. The wilderness became monsters. The dark became demons. The mountains became giants. And the deeper you look into mythology, the more you start noticing a pattern. Ancient people weren't just creating random creatures for entertainment. These things served a purpose. Because imagine trying to explain a hurricane before meteorology existed. Imagine trying to explain a tsunami, a drought, a plague, or even an earthquake. You can't really pull all the weather reports when your civilization is still trying to figure out whether bronze is the coolest thing ever invented. So instead, the unknown became personal. The unknown became alive. The unknown became something that could be named and feared. Because there's something deeply human about turning abstract terror into a creature. A storm is difficult to understand. A dragon? A dragon makes sense. You can picture it. You can draw it. You can tell stories about it. You can imagine defeating it. And that instinct shows up basically everywhere. Greek mythology had titans. Norse mythology had Jormungand. Christian mythology had Leviathan. Japanese folklore had enormous supernatural creatures and spirits. Different cultures, different monsters, same idea. Humanity kept taking things that felt too large to comprehend and gave them a body, giving them teeth, giving them a name. And for thousands of years, that was how monsters functioned. They were explanations.
Do me a favor. Lock this away in a vault so it doesn't turn into a giant monster and destroy the whole planet.
The way of making sense of a world that often seemed completely indifferent to human existence. But eventually, something changed. Humanity entered the modern age. Science advanced, technology exploded. We mapped out the oceans, studied the weather, split the atom, and supposedly we stopped needing monsters. Or at least that's the story we'd like to tell ourselves. Because despite all our technology, despite all our knowledge, despite convincing ourselves we finally outgrown mythology, in 1954, humanity created another monster. And this one would become bigger than all the others.
Have you noticed that our caps have actually got little pictures of skulls on them?
I don't,
Hands. Are we the baddies?
Which brings us to Godzilla and the Atomic Age, because in 1954, Japan created a monster, and unlike the dragons and sea serpents that came before it, we know exactly where this one came from. Because Godzilla wasn't born out of folklore, he wasn't born out of mythology, he wasn't some ancient legend passed down through generations. Godzilla was born from history, and more specifically, one of the most traumatic periods in human history. Because less than a decade before Godzilla appeared on movie screens, Japan experienced something no nation had ever experienced before: the atomic bomb. And I think it's difficult for modern audiences to fully appreciate just how horrifying that must have felt. Because before that moment, war had limits. Brutal limits, horrific limits, but limits. Then suddenly, humanity invented a weapon capable of erasing entire cities in a single flash.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
A weapon so destructive, it fundamentally changed how people thought about the future. For the first time in human history, civilization itself suddenly felt fragile. And then things get worse. Because after World War II ended, the atomic age didn't disappear, it accelerated. The United States, the Soviet Union, the arms race. Hydrogen bombs, bigger weapons, more powerful weapons. Entire generations growing up under the possibility that humanity could potentially vaporize itself at the push of a button. And in 1954, that fear was particularly fresh in Japan. Just months before Godzilla released, a Japanese fishing vessel known as the Lucky Dragon No. 5 was exposed to radioactive fallout from the Castle Bravo nuclear test, which was significantly more powerful than American scientists expected. And suddenly, that fear wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't history. It wasn't something that happened just once. It was still happening. The bombs were still casting a shadow. And then Godzilla arrived. Now, on the surface, Godzilla is kind of ridiculous. He's a giant radioactive dinosaur. He stomps buildings, breathes atomic fire, shows up from the ocean, and immediately starts causing insurance companies unimaginable psychological damage. But the original film isn't really interested in spectacle. Not in the way later monster movies are. Because the first Godzilla is surprisingly bleak, almost mournful. The destruction isn't exciting, it's tragic. The city burns, people die, families are separated, hospitals overflow, and if you pay attention to the imagery, it starts looking eerily familiar. Mass casualties, radiation, a population confronted by a force beyond its ability to control. Godzilla wasn't just a monster. Godzilla was nuclear fear made flesh. The bomb had become a creature. And this is where something really important happens, because radiation is invisible. You can't see it, you can't fight it, you can't reason with it. It's an abstract terror, the kind of fear that lives in the back of your mind. But Godzilla, you can see Godzilla. You can point at him, you can name him, you can tell stories about him. Humanity had taken something incomprehensible and given it a body, which suddenly starts sounding very familiar. Because thousands of years earlier, people turned storms into gods. They turned oceans into sea monsters. They turned the unknown into dragons. And now the modern world had done exactly the same thing. The only difference was the fear. The monsters evolved because the fear evolved. And once Godzilla existed, Once that formula had been created, the giant monster would never be the same again. Because if nuclear fear can become a monster, then anything could.
Well, that sucks.
And to be honest, that's exactly what happened. Because once Godzilla proved a modern fear can become a monster, humanity started making a lot of monsters. And the speed at which this genre exploded is kind of insane. Because Godzilla wasn't a one-hit wonder. The character returned again and again and again. Sequels, new monsters, new stories, new eras.
I'm alive!
Then came Gamera, a giant flying turtle, which is a sentence that somehow sounds both completely ridiculous and completely normal if you spent enough time around kaiju fans.
Wow, no.
Then came Ultraman, which took giant monsters and transformed them into something entirely different, because the monster became part of the spectacle, the attraction, the event. And before long, giant monsters were everywhere. Television, movies, toys, comic books. Entire generations grew up watching cities getting flattened on a weekly basis. And this is where something interesting starts to happen. Because as the genre grows, the monsters start changing. The original Godzilla was terrifying, a walking nuclear nightmare, a force of destruction. But over time, things got a little weird, a little more adventurous, a little more fantastical. Godzilla starts fighting other monsters, then aliens, then giant robot versions of himself. At one point, this franchise becomes so fucking unhinged that trying to explain it to someone outside the fandom sounds like you're describing a fever dream caused by expired medication.
Are you high or just incredibly stupid? I assure you, I am not high.
And yet, audiences loved it. Because the genre wasn't really about realism. It was about imagination, escalation, possibility. Every new monster represented a new idea, a new threat, a new spectacle, a new way to visualize something larger than ourselves. And nowhere is this more obvious than the explosion of tokusatsu, which is essentially Japanese special effects driven monsters and superhero tradition. Entire worlds built around giant creatures, impossible technology, alien invasions, and battles that regularly caused millions of dollars in fictional property damage.
I'm never gonna financially recover from this.
And if you're sitting there thinking, okay, but at this point, aren't they just making monsters because monsters are cool? Well, yeah, but also no. Because something important survived underneath all the rubber suits, pyrotechnics, and the increasingly aggressive violations of urban planning regulations: the monster itself. Not the specific design, not the specific story, the idea. Because even as these creatures became more entertaining, they never stopped representing something. Danger, chaos, the unknown. Forces larger than humanity. The details changed, the function didn't.
Same, but different, but still same.
And that's why the genre survived. Because monsters were never tied to one fear. It was tied to fear itself. That's the secret. Godzilla wasn't successful because people were specifically afraid of nuclear weapons. Godzilla was successful because humanity discovered a storytelling machine and a way to take an abstract anxiety and turn it into something you could see, fight, understand. And once that machine existed, it could be pointed at anything, which meant the monster was about to evolve again. Because as the decades passed, humanity began developing entirely new fears.
But wait, there's more. Hang on to your seat, baby, cause this one's a screamer. I'll be back.
Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, sure, Godzilla was about nuclear anxiety, Ultraman reflected Cold War fears, but what about the goofy stuff? Because eventually giant monsters stopped being confined to serious science fiction, they escaped. And suddenly they were showing up absolutely everywhere.
Nothing, it's just, it's everywhere I look now.
Saturday morning cartoons, children's television, toy commercials disguised as television shows, entire generations of kids waking up before sunrise to watch a giant monster get his teeth flossed with a fist before breakfast. Which raises a pretty interesting question. Why do children love giant monsters so much? I mean, if you think about it, if giant monsters are a manifestation of fear, why are kids constantly obsessed with them? Why aren't children running away from these things? Why would they keep buying the toys, watching the shows, or even pretending to be them on the playground? Because somewhere along the way, giant monsters became fun. Take Power Rangers. Every single week, some poor civilian would accidentally create a monster because they looked at Rita Repulsa funny, said the wrong thing, or existed within a 5-mile radius of the plot. The monsters attack the city, the Rangers fight it, then the monster grows to the size of a fucking skyscraper because apparently local zoning laws no longer apply.
Come with me, and you'll be in a world of OSHA violations.
The Mechazord shows up, buildings explode, problem solved, and roll credits. On the surface, it's completely ridiculous. But notice what's happening. Every single episode takes a problem and gives it a face, a shape, and a body. Something visible, something understandable, something a child can point at and say, that's the bad thing.
So say goodnight to the bad guy.
And children love that. Because the world is full of problems kids don't fully understand. School, growing up, bullies, rules, change. And that constant realization that adults are mostly improvising their way through existence and hoping nobody notices.
I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know I'm doing it really, really well.
To a child, these things can feel enormous, overwhelming, and chaotic. And a giant monster transforms that chaos into something simple, something concrete, something you can fight. Then you've got shows like Powerpuff Girls, which somehow managed to alternate between adorable cartoon comedy and what occasionally felt like a citywide disaster simulator. Giant monsters, alien invasions, mutant creatures, world-ending threats, all filtered through the perspective of childhood. Even the villains often felt like exaggerated versions of fears children already understood. The bully, the troublemaker, the thing hiding under the bed, just scaled up to absurd proportions. And then there's Dexter's Laboratory, a show which roughly 90% of the conflict could have been avoided if Dexter simply stopped creating horrors beyond human comprehension in his basement. Every week, some experiment goes wrong, some invention grows out of control, some creature escapes, and suddenly the city is dealing with another giant monster again. A problem becomes a monster, a mistake becomes a creature, and anxiety becomes something physical. And that's the pattern that keeps showing up. Even in comedy, even in cartoons, even in media designed for children, the monster survives because the monster is useful. Children don't process the world the same way adults do. Abstract concepts and complex systems and uncertainty are all very difficult, which is where the genre starts getting really interesting, because eventually those children grow up, and when they do, their monsters grow up too. And eventually, the monsters change again. Because in the 90s, the world was different. The Cold War was ending. The nuclear apocalypse everyone spent decades worrying about suddenly felt less immediate. Technology was accelerating. Globalization was accelerating. The future felt uncertain in entirely new ways. And then, in 1995, Neon Genesis Evangelion arrived. Which is probably one of the strangest things we've talked about so far, because on paper, Evangelion sounds like a fairly standard giant monster show. Humanity is under attack, mysterious beings known as angels are appearing, teenagers pilot giant biomechanical robots, the robots fight the monsters, humanity survives. Simple.
But there's this big war trying to basically destroy humanity because humanity has free will.
And there's a decision to which level we want to go to. We have free will, so evil's allowed to come and contend, not just good. And the elites themselves
believe they're racing or using human technology to try to take our best minds and build some type of breakaway civilization where they're going to merge with machines,
Except That's really not what Evangelion is about. And honestly, the longer the series goes on, the less interested it seems in giant monster battles at all. Because while Godzilla asks, what if a monster destroyed the city? Evangelion asks, what if you are the problem? And that's where things start getting weird. Because the angels aren't really characters, they're symbols, questions, manifestations of ideas the show is desperately trying to wrestle with. Identity, loneliness, connection, the fear of rejection, the fear of meaningless, the fear of being known. And perhaps most importantly, the fear of being human.
You want to break me down? You want to hear me say it? I'm scared!
Which sounds dramatic, but have you seen Evangelion? Dramatic is basically the franchise's natural state. Because unlike earlier kaiju stories, the threat isn't simply destruction. Humanity isn't just trying to survive, it's trying to understand itself. And the deeper the series goes, the less the monsters feel like physical threats, and the more they start feeling like psychological ones. The battles become internal, the horror becomes existential, the enemy becomes uncertainty itself. Which eventually culminates in End of Evangelion, a film that somehow manages to combine giant monsters, apocalyptic imagery, religious symbolism, depression, identity crisis, and enough psychological trauma to keep therapists employed for several fucking decades. And what's fascinating about all of this is that the monsters never actually disappear. The genre doesn't abandon kaiju, it evolves them. Because Godzilla reflects the fear of the atomic age, but Evangelion reflects the fear of a generation asking entirely different questions. Who am I? What gives life meaning? Can people truly understand each other? What does it mean to be human? And suddenly the giant monster isn't standing outside the city anymore. The giant monster is standing inside your head. Because that's exactly what makes Evangelion so important in the evolution of the genre, because it proves something. The monster doesn't need to represent a bomb, a war, or a disaster. The monster can represent an idea. A fear that has no physical form at all, and yet somehow it still becomes a giant creature. Because that's what humanity kept doing. The monsters evolved alongside the culture creating it. And by the time we entered the 21st century, the fear becomes even bigger. Because now humanity isn't just worried about itself, it's worried about the entire world. Now, by the time we do reach the 21st century, something interesting happens. The fears start getting harder to point out. Because the dragon is easy to understand, a giant monster is easy to understand. Even a nuclear bomb has a shape, a source, a target. But modern anxieties, those are messier, more complicated, and more systemic. And that's exactly what starts showing up in modern kaiju stories. Take Pacific Rim. Now, on the surface, Pacific Rim is one of the coolest movies ever made. Giant robots, giant monsters, cargo ships being used as melee weapons, the laws of physics being repeatedly beaten unconscious in broad daylight. It's fantastic, but underneath all that spectacle, the film is dealing with something much larger. Because the kaiju aren't really characters. They're catastrophes, natural disasters, extinction events. The kind of threat that doesn't care about borders, politics, or individual nations. And what is humanity's response? Global cooperation, massive infrastructure projects, entire societies reorganizing themselves around survival. The monsters aren't just attacking cities, they're testing civilization itself. Then there's Shin Godzilla, which may be one of the most fascinating monster movies ever made, and I think my personal favorite Godzilla film. Because unlike the original Godzilla, Shin Godzilla isn't primarily interested in nuclear anxiety, at least not directly. Instead, it's obsessed with bureaucracy, government paralysis, institutional failure, systems moving too slowly to respond to a rapidly evolving crisis. And what's amazing is that Godzilla barely changes. He's still Godzilla, he's still enormous, he's still terrifying. but the fear surrounding him has evolved. The monster isn't really the problem. The inability to respond to the monster is. And suddenly the film becomes less about destruction and more about a system under pressure, which feels incredibly modern because, let's be honest, a lot of contemporary fears don't come from a single villain. They come from institutions, processes, systems so large that nobody fully controls them. And then we get to Attack on Titan, which is where things become deeply uncomfortable. Because the Titans initially appear to be monsters, simple, terrifying, human versus giant creatures, classic kaiju stuff. Except the deeper the story goes, the less it becomes about monsters and the more it becomes about history, war, national identity, generational trauma, cycles of violence. The fear that humanity may be creating the very horrors it claims to be fighting. By the end of the series, the Titans almost feel secondary. The real monster is the system producing them, which is the theme you've probably noticed showing up a lot by now. Because modern fears are increasingly systemic. Climate change, political instability, economic uncertainty, and technological disruption. Problems that often feel bigger than the societies confronting them. And that's why the Monsterverse is so interesting. Because these films constantly frame their creatures less like animals and more like forces of nature. Godzilla, Kong, Ghidorah, Titans sleeping beneath the earth itself, ancient powers beyond human control. Humanity doesn't defeat them. Humanity survives around them. So let's take a step back for a second. Because at this point, we've covered a pretty ridiculous range of giant monsters. Dragons, Leviathan, Godzilla, Gamera. These things almost have nothing in common. Some are gods, some are animals, some are aliens. But the point is, they look different, they behave differently, they come from different countries, different cultures, different eras, and different fears, and yet somehow they all keep appearing over and over and over again. Why? Because I don't think the monster itself is what survives. I think the function survives. Because if you look at every example we've talked about, the pattern starts becoming difficult to ignore. Ancient civilizations feared the unknown, so they created dragons, sea serpents, titans. The atomic age feared nuclear annihilation, so it created Godzilla. The post-war era feared invasion, disasters, and technological uncertainty, so giant monsters exploded across television. Children feared chaos, growing up, problems they couldn't fully understand. So cartoons gave those problems a face, names, and bodies. Evangelion's generation wrestled with identity, isolation, and meaning. So the monsters move inward. And modern audiences increasingly fear systems, collapse, and instability. Forces so large no individual can control them. So modern kaijus become extinction events, environmental disasters, living embodiment of societal anxieties. Different monsters, different stories, different fears, same mechanism. And yeah, that is my completely normal and definitely not obsessive deep dive into the way humanity keeps creating giant monsters. If you enjoyed watching me connect Godzilla, Evangelion, Power Rangers, dragons, ancient mythology, and flying turtles into what has essentially become a 30-minute TED Talk about collective human anxiety, go ahead and hit that like button. Consider it your contribution to funding whatever poor city is about to get flattened by the next metaphor humanity invents. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into media, culture, technology, psychology, and whatever completely reasonable topic I decide to overanalyze until it turns into an existential crisis. And let me know in the comments, what do you think your generation's kaiju is? If giant monsters are a reflection of what society fears the most, what monster would represent our current moment? And if you enjoyed this video, check out my last essay, The Matrix, The Prison of Choice, where I dive into the Matrix trilogy, The Illusion of Freedom, and the completely sleep-deprived conspiracy spiral about whether machines actually learned how to turn rebellion itself into a system of control. And always, thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one.